So today we want to talk about an interesting story that just broke light, showing how deep the corruption in the space industry with NASA, Boeing and other usual suspects goes. In more positive news, of course we want to analyze last week's Starlink launch. It was a full success, but when can we finally see the first Starlink internet coverage?
And then of course we also have to take a look at the status of both starships. I mean, that is kind of compulsory, right? And on Mars, some strange stuff is happening. The methane mystery gets even more mysterious as now an additional oxygen mystery is discovered. What the hell's going on there? So stay tuned for these highly interesting developments.
So let's start with a quite brutal revelation that just recently surfaced in a NASA report by the Inspector General from the Office of Audits. And what they found basically 100% confirms what everyone watching this channel already knew. There's a brutal amount of corruption going on with NASA, especially in how they give out their contracts and to whom they give out their contracts. As we all know, NASA has given contracts to Boeing and SpaceX within the Commercial Crew Transportation Program, with the goal of launching astronauts to the ISS from American soil again. So SpaceX would of course do this with their almost ready Crew Dragon capsule, which would be launched on a Falcon 9 rocket, whereas Boeing would do this with their Starliner CST-100 capsule launched by an Atlas V rocket. Since the Falcon 9 is almost fully reusable, SpaceX's solution is much cheaper and more efficient, costing only $55 million versus the $90 million proceeds from Boeing. So one would of course assume, since NASA is a scientific organization, that money would be much more wisely spent on SpaceX, right? Nope.
Instead, Boeing received a quite nice $4.2 billion compared to SpaceX, which received only $2.6 billion for the Commercial Crew Transportation Program. So Boeing received 61.5% more money for delivering the exact same goals. The same goals! 61.5% more! But this goes even further, because the report shows that Boeing was overpaid 287 million US dollars on top of the fixed contract price. Why? Because Boeing probably threatened to leave the Crew Commercial Transportation Program, so NASA was basically forced to pay more. So NASA was probably afraid that SpaceX wouldn't make it in time after the explosions they suffered back in 2015 and 2016, as we remember. NASA probably thought, let's pay Boeing a brutal amount to ensure that they won't leave us hanging. But don't worry, because NASA defended the move, saying the final price increase was agreed to by NASA and Boeing and was reviewed and approved by numerous NASA officials at the Kennedy Space Center and headquarters. Then of course everything is fine. Thanks for clarifying that. If officials from NASA and Boeing approved that process, then everything is fine, of course, right? So in other words, don't worry guys, because this corrupt process was 100% approved by corrupt people over at NASA and Boeing. So nothing to worry about, everything is fine.
Please disperse! Nothing to see here, please!
So yeah, this story is 100% confirmation of the ranting we regularly do on this channel here, on how much money is wasted on Polish companies like Lockheed, Boeing or Northrop. These companies are far more inefficient than SpaceX, offer worse products, need at least as long, most of the time however longer than SpaceX for achieving less, but get paid much more. Nice! No wonder, ladies and gentlemen, that we haven't managed to get back to the moon yet. No wonder that NASA's crewed spaceflight program didn't go anywhere in the last few decades. With such a level of corruption, it would be a miracle if we would have had a moon base by now. Okay, let's calm ourselves again and try to talk about the more positive developments, in order not to transform into Hulk here.
And that is of course the successful launch of 60 new Starlink satellites, which launched last week on Monday, the 11th of November from Space Launch Complex 40 at Cape Canaveral Air Force Station in Florida. Of course with the trusted Falcon 9, which had already launched 3 times before, making it now the 4th reuse of this rocket, and the first time a payload fairing was also reused. So rocket history was again being written here by SpaceX. And now we could already witness this new train of 60 Starlink satellites move along across the sky again. So then of course the question, when will we finally have the first Starlink service? Well, SpaceX plans another incredible 6 Starlink launches until mid-2020, so that this would allow Starlink coverage by that time, but first only to North American customers.
Full worldwide coverage would be available after 24 launches, so sometime by 2020. By the way, as for the concerns of the astronomy community, SpaceX is working hard on reducing the visibility of their satellites and making them as unreflective as possible. Even now, the satellites are mostly only visible at dawn or dusk, and decreasing reflectivity would probably reduce the issues caused by Starlink for optical ground-based astronomy to a tolerable amount. And Starlink, as we always like to remind our audience, is absolutely pivotal for our future in space. Keep in mind please, without Starlink, no moon base, no Mars base.
Now the Starlink revenue is estimated to be at least $40 billion by the mid-2020s. 40 billion, that is twice NASA's annual budget. And this money will be absolutely needed if we want to become a multiplanetary civilization. We should always keep that in mind. What do you think is better, having perfect astrophotos of nebulas and galaxies and galaxy clusters every time, but being stuck on Earth like idiots? Or is it better to sometimes redo an astrophoto or have it to do it multiple times until no Starlink satellite passes in front of it, but be a multiplanetary species with colonies on the Moon, on Mars, even on the moons of Jupiter, on the moons of Saturn, above the clouds of Venus, and one day maybe even send interstellar missions to other star systems? What do you think is better?
And now, of course, we have to take a look at the current status of Starship. As we know, at Boca Chica, the Mark I prototype has been partially reassembled, being divided into 2 halves, getting new flaps and landing legs. A hexagonal launch pad had been constructed, where the lower part is erected, and the preparations for fueling tests have already begun. We might receive a really nice Christmas present this year, with Starship launching around that time. Would be really awesome! Over at Coco, not much has happened since our last week's news update, as we can see in these latest shots by John Winkop. But at the Kennedy Space Center, we can see the rectangular launch mount for Starship being continued. The real action for the upcoming weeks will be at Boca Chica, and we will keep a close eye on the developments as always.
And meanwhile on Mars, some very mysterious stuff keeps happening. We all by now at least heard about the methane mystery, where the Curiosity rover on multiple occasions picked up seasonal methane variations, where during the summer months the methane ratio spikes and during the winter months is much lower. Now this process can be explained by non-biological processes, however there is really the distinct possibility that these seasonal methane fluctuations arise due to biological processes, namely by some form of subsurface bacteria present on Mars. And now this theory gets more likely because on top of the methane variations, now also seasonal oxygen variations have been discovered. Now these newly reported results were measured with Curiosity's sample analysis at Mars, the so-called SAM instrument, a small chemistry lab that the rover carries with it. So as it turns out now, oxygen also shows very strong seasonal variations, very similar to the methane. Now, of course, this phenomenon probably still can be explained with non-biological processes. However, the idea that Mars bacteria or some simple Mars organisms hidden within the surface of Mars are responsible for these seasonal variations did increase in likelihood.
This is another strong reason why humanity has to go to Mars and investigate further. It wouldn't surprise us if we found primitive, probably single-celled organisms deep down in the Martian lava tubes and caves, remnants of the once very life-friendly conditions that were prevalent on Mars billions of years ago. It would have a huge impact on our understanding of the likelihood of life, and would give a strong boost to the theory that the universe is full of life, like really full of it, which we think, by the way, is extremely likely.
So we hope you enjoyed this episode, even though it started with a quite brutal amount of corruption. So what do you think can be done against this?
And do you think that bacteria are responsible for the seasonal fluctuations of oxygen and methane on Mars?
I think yes. I hope so. So as always, be sure to subscribe and turn on that notification bell, because we regularly upload 2 videos per week, mostly on space topics, but also electric cars and other disruptive technologies. So then, see you next time.
Oh! 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 Oh!
It's so